Good evening all. Welcome to the first event of the spring semester of the USF Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. My name is Jeremy Brown. I teach here at USF in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Tonight we present the first in a three-part series engaging the work of scholars researching the ancient, medieval, and modern history of Jewish-Christian relations. Our esteemed guest this evening, Professor Roberto, will be formally introduced shortly. Founded in 2008, the USF Jewish Studies and Social Justice program is the first and only program in the history of the United States formally linking Jewish studies with social justice. In addition to offering numerous courses related to this interdisciplinary field, our program offers a minor in JSSJ, as well as a number of educational events that are free and open to the public, including an annual speaker series on the complexities of Jewish identity, an annual human rights lecture, and an annual social justice lecture, as well as an annual social justice Passover Seder. This spring, in addition to tonight's exciting event, we present several other JSSJ events. 4 weeks from tonight, on Thursday, March 8th, at 6:30 p.m. in this very room, we'll host the second part of our series on Jewish-Christian relations with Spanish-Canadian scholar Guadalupe González-Villegas of the Université de Montréal. As our featured medievalist, González will give a talk titled Differences in a Skin, Christian Views on Foreskin, and Jewish Views on the Virgo. Then, on Sunday, March 15th, we'll have our 9th annual JSSJ Social Justice Lecture at 7 p.m. at the Jewish Community Center here in San Francisco, less than 1 mile from campus. It's titled Prison Injustice, Mass Incarceration, Police Reform, and People of Color. This event will be a conversation between Rabbis Jill Jacobs and Michael Lezak on issues related to the prison industrial complex. As Executive Director of True Law, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, Rabbi Jill Jacobs is at the vanguard of the Jewish human rights movement, working to mobilize 1,800 Jewish clergy persons and tens of thousands of American Jews to protect human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. Rabbi Michael Lezak is staff rabbi at the Glide Center for Social Justice at Glide Memorial Church and Foundation. Then, on Wednesday, April 4th at 6 p.m. in the same building in the Xavier Room, we will have our 9th annual Passover event. The event is called Racial Inclusivity and Justice Passover Seder. It's co-led in partnership with Bechol Lashon, a leading Jewish American organization working to grow and strengthen Jewish communities through ethnic, cultural, and racial inclusivity, and acclaimed writer and Bay Area poet and friend of mine, Andrew Raymer. On Tuesday, April 17th at 6:30 p.m. in this room, we will hear from our third and final speaker of this year's Jewish-Christian Relations Speaker Series, celebrated author and religion scholar Ariel Evan Maisy of Stanford University will deliver a lecture on Jewish-Christian relations in the modern period. His talk is titled Beyond the Pale, Visions of Christianity in Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism. Our final program of the spring semester will be held Sunday, April 22nd at 4 p.m. at Congregation Emmanuel, less than a mile from campus also, where we will celebrate the 40th anniversary of USF's Jewish Studies program. During this event, we will hear from journalist Jake Tapper, CNN's chief Washington correspondent, who will address the moral imperative to speak truth to power. If interested in being put on our listserv to stay informed about Swig program events, please add your name to the sign-up sheet, which can be found just outside the door. A special thanks for supporting tonight's event goes to our co-sponsors, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, the Joan and Ralph Lane Center for Catholic Studies and Social Thought, and the USF Jesuit Foundation. I also wish to acknowledge our community partners at Grace Cathedral, Congregation Beth Shalom, and Lehrhaus Judaica. So I'd like to begin the evening's program formally by delineating the main reasons why I've worked to put this speaker series together. I'll share with you 7 main objectives for the series. The first is to promote historical understanding from a relational perspective. The series aims to stimulate exchange between researchers, students, faculty, staff, and the community at large in exploring the 2,000-year history of relations between Judaism and Christianity, examining the ways in which the protracted engagement between these two religions has propelled the internal development of each. This is a history characterized by a broad range of relationship dynamics, admiration, fascination, and cooperation, as well as abhorrence, deceit, and violence. Second, to understand polemical constructions of religious identity. The program is a forum for discussing this relationship from an analytical perspective which is neither apologetic nor polemical. Our goal, however, is not to defend or justify a history fraught with violence, but rather to impart a better understanding of the profound role that interreligious polemic has played in the complex formation of both Jewish and Christian religious identities through the centuries. Third, to reflect on dangers of polemical rhetoric, especially when directed against vulnerable populations. Recent shifts in the tone of national political rhetoric necessitate widespread reflection on the profound dangers of polemicizing against vulnerable populations in order to consolidate and homogenize national identity. While sociologically speaking, many aspects of the Jewish-Christian relationship are unique, thinking about this particular relationship gives us pause to reflect on the kinds of asymmetrical relationships that obtain between communities with disproportionate access to forms of social, legal, and political representation. Fourth, to foster an historically critical sense of community identity. USF has an avowed interest in promoting Catholic identity among its student body, while at the same time seeking to impart values of social justice. One of the more confusing, sometimes painful discoveries for undergraduates exploring the history of Jewish-Christian relations is that the exaltation of triumphalist claims of Christian religious supremacy, claims reinforced by demonstrable assertions of Christian political dominance. This kind of exaltation does not sit comfortably with what comes to mind today when we invoke social justice values. To the contrary, historically speaking, such claims of supremacy and dominance have exacerbated a rhetoric of violence against outgroups, a rhetoric which has mandated the subordination and persecution of religious and ethnic populations perceived as out of step with church norms. The series intends to help students account for such discrepancies between past and present, to prompt critical conversations about the tensions which exist between, on the one hand, the promotion of an historically uncritical sense of religious identity, and on the other hand, the pursuit of social justice values. Fifth, to address the relevance of Jewish-Christian relationship for students of any or no religious background. While the series is offered at a Catholic institution avowing a Jesuit mission, it does not adopt the approach of promoting one particular religious identity above any other. Rather, it aims to provide resources from the history of religions for an audience of any or no religious background. Resources for thinking about how communal identities are forged in relationship to perceived identities of others. And resources for thinking about how intercommunal dynamics impact the way groups define themselves internally. Sixth, bear with me, we're almost through my long-winded list of objectives. Sixth, to make Jewish-Christian relations scholarship accessible to the broader community. The lecture series is intended to ameliorate strained relationships between religious communities, but primarily through the lucid evaluation of the past and the promotion of historical understanding. Thus, the series highlights the works of our region's preeminent scholars. The prioritization of scholarly accounts is founded on the cautious premise that any community-based efforts at reconciliation that are not based on a rigorous assessment of the past will not likely achieve more than tentative results. The lecture conversation format of the program intends to make historically critical perspectives on Jewish-Christian relations more accessible to the broader community. And lastly, 7, it's our goal to stimulate scholarship, and scholarship that's publicly engaged. The series anticipates that increased public awareness of the historical problems of Jewish-Christian relations will have a reciprocally stimulating effect on the scholarship itself. And moreover, we aim to encourage and empower scholars to reflect judiciously on the public applications of their research. So it's my hope that this evening's program will help to move us towards these various objectives. As already intimated, tonight's event, exploring problems related to researching Jewish-Christian relations in the ancient world, features Professor Roberto Mata. Professor Mata joins us from Santa Clara University, where he serves as assistant professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He earned his doctoral degree in New Testament and Early Christianity from Harvard Divinity School. His research specializes in ancient apocalyptic literature, which he interprets in rather untraditional ways, applying the lenses of borderlands, post-colonial, and critical race theories to the traditional apocalyptic discourse. Professor Mata has received several prestigious awards for his excellent teaching. This evening, his talk will address problems posed by the book of Revelations, otherwise known as the Apocalypse of John, for the study of ancient Judaism and Christianity. Following the lecture, Professor Mata and I will have a conversation, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A with those gathered today, and we'll end close to 8 o'clock. So without further ado, please welcome our distinguished guest, Roberto Mata.
Good evening. It is truly a privilege to be with you here today. It seems to be warmer in my side of California than Santa Clara for some reason. It's sunny and joyful there. It certainly fits into the idea that the Santa Clara campus is like a gold cloth. Things are just so great. While preparing for this talk, I was thinking about the implications that the book of Revelation has for today's conversations on interreligious dialogue. And as I was hearing my colleagues speak about the objectives of the lecture series, I was relieved that, at least in that respect, I hope this lecture achieves its goals. I'm going to try to do something a bit different. I'm going to alternate between lecturing and engaging you, hopefully in a conversation as I move along. Hopefully I'll have enough time. If not, you'll let me know. I hardly lecture at Santa Clara. I tend to do more of a discussion-based engagement with my students. So the talk for today is titled The Synagogue of Satan, Jewish-Christian Polemics, or Negotiations of Ethnicity. And it was supposed to be a question. When we talk about the Apocalypse of John, however, there are multiple images that come to mind. Images that somehow I feel the need to unsettle and disturb. Think of the term for just a minute. The ways in which it circulates in contemporary culture, and what images, again, come to mind. When I first learned about the apocalypse, at least this is what I thought it was all about. Destruction, annihilation, certainly the extinction of the human race. And yet, the popular understanding of apocalypse misses, to a great degree, what the text is all about. And part of my objective today is to try to kind of re-educate us about the message of the text itself, as you will find out. Some of the implications that it has for today still may ring doomsday overtones. Here's a Middle Ages representation of some of the imagery that is depicted or at least alluded to in the text. Here you see a dragon with 7 heads. What else do you see?
Lion with 7 heads.
Yes, some sort of lion with 7 heads, indeed. What else? Yeah, for sure, like a dragon. It is not Game of Thrones. Okay, let's get that clear. What else do you see?
Halo veiled woman. A halo veiled woman.
Yes, some sort of a woman for sure. She's carrying a book of swords. Very good. And so, as you see, the book of Revelation, otherwise known as the Apocalypse of John, captured the imagination of its readers very early on, and most of what sparked the curiosity of people into exploring the text was precisely its enigmatic symbols that at times people did not know how to understand. One particular scholar referred to the book of Revelation as an enigmatic book from hell, because they just had such a hard time understanding it. Joachim of Fiora, an abbot and mystic of the 12th, 13th century or so, tried to understand the book of Revelation and write a commentary on it, but realized that in order to do so, at least he claimed that needed some special type of revelation himself, because of the complexities involved in understanding this text. So, in order to give you some sort of background for you to understand what the apocalypse is all about, I felt it was important to begin to, again, establish a historical context. To begin with here, in terms of authorship, a lot of people think that the book of Revelation was written by John the Apostle, St. John, who is mentioned in the Gospels. Others think that the Apocalypse was written by John, who was presbyter of a church in Asia Minor in the 2nd century CE. But when we look at the text itself, we find that there are no self-references by the author as an apostle necessarily. And so the claims that scholars make about the interpretation or the historical background of the text are a bit ungrounded. In terms of the date, this also varies. Some people date the text to 70 CE, others to 150 CE, and yet others to a date around 95, 100 CE, the reign of Emperor Domitian, whose image you see in this particular slide. Now, why the change in dates, you might ask? The book of Revelation talks about this tribulation, this sense of persecution, this urgency for the people of God to heed the words of the prophet John and pretty much prepare themselves for what they perceive to be some upcoming persecution or destruction over the 7 ecclesiae or the churches. And I'll say more about that in a minute. In terms of the provenance, it is believed that the book of Revelation was written in Asia Minor, in an island, very small island off the coast of Turkey, known as Patmos. For sure, the author himself in the text claims that he was in the island of Patmos when he received this particular revelation. He had this mystical encounter, if you will, with the resurrected Jesus. And it all took place in this particular island. Now, it's interesting to discuss the question of genre, because the Apocalypse itself gave the name to the genre that we know as apocalyptic literature, both Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature. And I'll say a few more things about that in just a minute. So with that sort of basic background information, I will begin my lecture. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the book of Revelation is commonly associated with issues around the end of the world, seven-headed beast, as we just saw, but also Judgment Day. So much so that the very term apocalypse these days is synonymous with doomsday scenarios. That is at least what our former governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, will have us believe. Yet, even those interested in a less sensationalistic understanding of this first century text, they will find out that it is difficult to ignore that Revelation does exhibit what African-American scholar and theologian Musa Dubi refers to as an imperializing contradiction. On the one hand, Revelation's visions of justice for the oppressed has informed liberation and decolonial movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. On the other hand, the text also shows an imperializing vision that marginalizes those that disagree with the author, and in particular, a group of Jews to whom he refers to as a synagogue of Satan. And not only that, he also links these individuals with the imperial forces, the Roman imperial forces that oppress the people of God. Now, traditionally, scholars have read this invective against the so-called synagogue of Satan as representative of a Jewish Christian polemic. And this interpretation has persisted from early Christianity up until our time. A second interpretation of this group is that it reflects a so-called group of God-fearers, or Gentiles that embrace Judaism to a certain extent, but that never quite fully converted. And that there's somehow something wrong with their practice that then the prophet John is trying to correct. Now, seeing Revelation as a Christian text is complex, because these interpretations, as I will show in just a minute, are based on a series of discursive assumptions, such as the so-called parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, and also normalize early Christian prejudices of the anti-Christian Jew. Indeed, in a complicated history of Jewish-Christian relations, Revelation has played a truly apocalyptic role. Insofar as it has fed the infamous Contra Judaeus tradition ascribed to John Chrysostom, or John the Golden Mouthed, would that be a fair translation? Who was Bishop of Antioch between 349 and 407 CE. So in his homilies, Chrysostom vilifies synagogues as brothels and accuses Jews of deicide. How many of you have heard that word before? Deicide. What does that mean?
Basically referring to the Jews were the ones who killed Jesus.
Yes, indeed. It's the accusation that the Jews were guilty of the death of Jesus, even though the Gospels themselves reveal that the Roman authorities were always somewhere in the background. Revelation's portrait of the Jews has fields of processionist interpretations of biblical texts, as well as anti-Semitic sentiments, some of which have led to gruesome acts of violence against the Jewish community throughout history, in Europe as well as in other places of the world. Although in the encyclical Nostra Aetate, the Church acknowledges that only some Jews were involved in the death of Jesus and denounces the hatred and persecution of all, but especially the Jewish people. Work remains to be done. Biblical texts such as Revelation continue to play a crucial role in the spiritual formation of 2.3 billion Christians throughout the world. From average believers to seminarians, to college and university students, the acknowledgement for Nostra Aetate, while significant, is not sufficient. And I think you can recognize that with me. Indeed, scholars and theologians have recognized the responsibility to engage in what Harvard scholar Elizabeth Schulze Fiorenza, and former advisor of mine, refers to as an ethics of interpretation. An ethics of interpretation. That is, a particular approach and attitude towards the text that would map not only the oppressive power relations inscribed in biblical texts, but also the various methods, discourses, and layers of interpretation that enable them. So in order to map the construction and negotiation of ethnic identity boundaries in the book of Revelation, in my lecture today, I will explore the following set of questions. First, what are the notions of ethnicity, categories of Jewishness that are present in the book of Revelation? How are ethnic boundaries constructed, negotiated, and at times, yes, indeed, trespass? And also at the end, I want to ask, and hopefully you can help me answer this question, why would a reading of the so-called Synagogue of Satan in ethnic terms be of significance for Jewish-Christian relations? What would the implications be for Jewish-Christian dialogue? In order to address this question, my lecture draws from Denise Beale's work on ethnicity in antiquity, as well as Frantz Fanon's analysis of colonial situations of domination. Then from this foundation, I will suggest that John's understanding of Jewishness in relation to this polemic with the so-called Synagogue of Satan contains an ethnic dimension that intersects with religious and geographic and ethnic, for sure, connotations. The John of Patmos constructs the boundaries of Jewish ethnicity around food sacrificed to idols and patrols them by excluding members that do not subscribe to his views on what particular foods to consume. And that the Synagogue of Satan transgressed these boundaries as a way of negotiating what I refer to as the colonial situation of the Jewish diaspora in Asia Minor in 100 CE. Now I said a few things about the historical context of Revelation, its authorship, and its genre. So I would proceed to discuss the literary rhetorical context of the text and why that is important for us. In the text where references to the so-called Synagogue of Satan emerge, we see three main issues. The first one is this polemic about food that has been sacrificed to idols, Revelation 2:18. The second point is this reference to the so-called Synagogue of Satan, and finally, this allusion to the worship of the beast. Up until now, scholars have believed that the polemic on food sacrificed to idols is entirely detached from the polemic against the so-called Synagogue of Satan. But this view is contingent on the idea that the seven messages are actually literary letters of sorts, that were delivered to individual, quote-unquote, churches. Now we know that that is not the case. That in fact, the very term ecclesia that we at times translate as church may be more rightly translated as a civic assembly, in reference to Greek democratic assemblies of Greek citizens, again, that meant to legislate on affairs pertaining to the polis. So in these so-called messages to the seven assemblies, the author imagines or has a vision of Jesus that gives him a command to write on a scroll the visions that he will receive and deliver these messages to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And these are all cities that were located in this particular part of ancient Anatolia, which is today modern Turkey. The island of Patmos would have been somewhere in this region over here. Now, in these particular messages, the author writes and praises some of the assemblies for their love, for their patient endurance, for their sacrifices, for dealing with their poverty, but also for refusing to eat what he refers to as idolothita, or translated as food sacrificed to idols. In the assemblies of Pergamum and Thyatira, the author essentially trashes, excuse the term, prophets and leaders who in his view are promoting what seems to be an idolatrous teaching. idolathuta, and porneia. Indeed, one consistent aspect is that the author demonizes those who seem to embrace the teaching, referring to them along names of very infamous figures in the history of Israel, including Jezebel, Balaam, and of course, those who are part of the so-called Synagogue of Satan. In the messages to Smyrna and Philadelphia, we read, and I quote, "I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know this land there on the part of those who say that they are Jews, but they are not, but are indeed a synagogue of Satan." Writing to another assembly, this one in the city of Philadelphia, "I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know this land there on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not. And again, they are a synagogue of Satan." From this set of issues, it appears that the main exigency seems to be the presence of teachers and prophets who are promoting the consumption of food that has been sacrificed, quote unquote, to what the author refers to as idols. But indeed, we know that it actually refers to participation of meats consumed in ritual cult to Roman emperors and Greco-Roman deities. Now, I want to say a few more things about the different interpretations of the text, of this labeling of the other as a synagogue of Satan. Through the history of Christian biblical interpretation, the book of Revelation in particular, from Victorino's commentary on this text to modern scholarship, representations of the so-called synagogue of Satan as believed by others have prevailed. There are at least three major interrelated interpretations about who this group that John so defies is. The first interpretation is that the so-called synagogue of Satan refers to anti-Christian Jews. And this is the most widely circulated interpretation. These are Jews from the local synagogues at Smyrna who were somehow participants in the affliction, imprisonment, and potential death of members of the church. However, scholars such as David L. Barr, John W. Marshall, and others suggest that there is hardly any evidence of Jewish persecution in the Apocalypse. And when apparent in other sources, it is only as a rhetorical trope. I will add that this particular trope is actually imported from martyrological material in the 3rd and 2nd century, such as the martyrdom of Polycarp, where the Jews emerge as delatores, who are agitating the masses against the Jews so that the proconsul and the Roman authorities would persecute them. But then again, this is an importation, an anachronistic reading of 2nd century material into a 1st century text. This view also presupposes the so-called parting of the ways. I'm not sure if you heard of this concept before, but this refers to this idea that Judaism and Christianity, at some point, early in the 1st century or so, people think, separated and became established separate entities. Judaism on the one hand, Christianity on the other, with well-defined identities and teachings. Yet, as Daniel Boyarin has suggested, Judaism and Christianity were phenomenologically indistinguishable as entities in the early stages of their development. In his view, this is the case not merely in the conventional accepted sense that Christianity was Judaism, but in the sense that differences that were in the fullness of time to constitute the very basis for the distinction between the two religions ran through and not between the nascent groups of Jesus' followers and Jews who did not follow Jesus. The second alternative, or interpretation of the so-called synagogue of Satan, is that they were God-fearers. And the God-fearers is not necessarily people who were afraid of God, if that's what you're thinking. Rather, this Phobomenos ton Theon, or the Theosebis, refers to a group of Gentiles who embraced certain aspects of Judaism, and as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, did not fully convert it, but were content with adopting particular practices, such as those described in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 17. However, part of the problem is that both the assemblies of Smyrna and Philadelphia receive nothing but praise, and there is no indication whatsoever that John is critiquing the faith of the community. The third interpretation of the so-called Synagogue of Satan, and one that is perhaps most consistent with Jewish material from the Second Temple period, is that it is actually reflective of an intra-Jewish Christian polemic. Yale professor Adela Yarber Collins and others have explored this polemic as an intra-Jewish skirmish. Indeed, the New Testament is filled with skirmishes of this sort, where Jesus denounces the Jews as sons of the devil, and John the Baptist refers to Pharisees as brood of vipers. Yet, Jesus was a Jew, and John the Baptist was a Jew, and it is precisely on these grounds that they read the text as an inter-Jewish polemic. We also see these polemics reflected in the Damascus document, in the community rule, which at times acknowledge the presence of imperial power, but also denounce the ways in which people from Jerusalem collude with Roman colonizers. And so they refer to them as a horde of Satan, as well as an assembly of deceit. So as you see, this labeling is not uncommon. According to Florentino Garcia Martinez, these terms elucidate the mechanisms of appropriation through which the author ultimately refers to others as the sons of David, the root of David, on the one hand, but also to others as in particular those who fail to keep God's precepts as sons of the pit. And in his view, these individuals have fallen in the nets of Belial, which he numbers as 1, fornication, 2, wealth, and 3, defilement of the temple. Now, what if we were to read the Synagogue of Satan in a different way? What if we were to explore not only the religious, but also the ethnic dimensions that surely seem embedded in this labeling, and not merely as an intra-Jewish Christian polemic? How can we think about Jewishness as describing a type of ethnicity? In her book, Why This New Race, Denise Kimberly Beale explores what she refers to as ethnic reasoning, the ways in which, in New Testament texts, people articulate ideas of belonging to a particular nation, peoplehood, claims to descent, claims of belonging to a particular tribe. And so, according to Beale, ethnic reasoning refers to these modes of persuasion that may or may not include the use of a specific vocabulary of peoplehood. She suggests that ethnic reasoning afforded early Christians the opportunity to legitimize various forms of Christianness as the universal, most authentic manifestation of humanity on the one hand, and it also offered Christians a way to define themselves relative to outsiders on the other, and to also compete with insiders, and even try to assert superiority over various and varying visions of Christianness. So in her work, she also challenges the criterion that ethnicity must include claims to common kinship and descent. While she acknowledges that appeals to kinship and descent are one significant way in which the reality and essence, in what she terms fixity, of ethnicity race is articulated, she posits that approaching the category of race and ethnicity, as well as religion, as being characterized by this double discourse of fixity and fluidity, allows us to revise prevailing interpretations of the significance of race and ethnicity for early Christians. Now, how are we to understand this category of Jewishness? In Revelation, the author uses the term Judaioi to refer to those who claim to be Jews, but in his view are not. It's interesting, in his work, Harvard professor Shaya Cohen offers an interesting take on what he sees the threefold meaning of the concept of Jewishness, or the concept of Judaioi. He says, first and foremost, Judaioi refers to a Judean, and this as a function of ethnicity, as a reference to birth, but also to geography. A Judean is a member of the Judean people or a nation. Roman historian Polybius talks about the ethnos of the Judeans. Second, there is also a function of religion or culture, where the term Jew or Judeo is a reference to those who worship God, whose temple is in Jerusalem, and those who follow the way the way of life of the Jews. And third, a Judeo is also a citizen or an ally of the Judean state, which is more a function of politics. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus also talks about some of the alliances that some Jewish rulers, such as John Hyrcanus, made with the Idumeans, who were not Jews, but who by virtue of a political alliance were named as such. Although Cohen suggests that in the diaspora and its social-political complexities, the ethnic dimension of Judeo took precedence over the others that I just mentioned, I want to propose that perhaps we read this concept of Judeo ethnically, but keeping the three dimensions in the background and in tension with one another. Why? Well, it will be helpful to understand too the ways in which this concept of Judeo appears too in Josephus, where the term appears accompanied by this word genos, the genos Judeo, which invariably has been translated in ethnic terms as race, ethnicity, and descent, and maintains the different dimensions that Professor Cohen introduced. So in this ethnic sense, one can think with Cohen of Jewishness in the diaspora as a type of imagined community, to use Benedict Anderson's term. A community of members who share a sense of common origin, cling to a common and distinctive history and destiny, and possess one or more distinctive characteristics, and feel a sense of collective uniqueness and solidarity. Now, what about the use of ethnic categories in Revelation? It's interesting because here we see the author mapping the categories in rather dualistic terms. So John uses vocabulary of peoplehood and descent for sure when he uses the formulaic phrase people, tribe, tongue, and nation to refer to the people of God, and those who have been saved or redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. John also notes that those who have been saved or redeemed by the Lamb are worthy to enter the New Jerusalem, that is the city or paradise that God has prepared for them. So in these references, the author uses the terms laos and ethnos as a positive reference to the people of God. Now it's interesting, and this will help us connect with our earlier analysis on the primary issues in the apocalypse being this idea of food sacrificed to idols, that the author uses also this phrase, the conquering ones, to refer to people who have abstained from participating in these sort of cultic rituals. So this idea that the people of God are the conquering ones is certainly a point that the author of Revelation wants you to get. At the same time, he also refers or uses the term ta ethne, the nations, to refer to those who commit idolatry, worship the beast with 7 heads that we just saw, which, by the way, is, at least the scholars agree, is a reference to Roman imperialism, and in particular to the emperor, and stand to be excluded from the New Jerusalem. So the rhetorical situation of Smyrna helps us understand the implications of this idea of the nations. So just as those who are from every tribe, tongue, and nation, the conquering ones, the idolatrous ones are also those of the nations who have been deceived by the devil. So the author uses this concept of idolatry to link the nations to the followers of the beast. Now the concept of idolatry is interesting, and the connection emerges in that the author casts participation in food sacrifice to idols as a satanic practice, one that ranges from eating food offered to idols to outright worship of the beast. Such connection is evident in John's critique of multiple iterations of this particular idea. He begins gradually with exhortations against food sacrifice to idols in chapter 2, but then he links it with his critique of idol worship in chapter 9, where he states that the idolatrous people of the nations, the ethnic, refuse to repent from their idolatry and to abandon the idols. And then, in chapter 13, he actually presents the beast and its image, which is given life, and which the people of the world are commanded to worship under penalty of death. And so he then ends with this exclusion of idolaters in chapter 21, when he sees this vision of the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And so gradually throughout the text, the author has worked out or weaved this interesting idea that the nations are equal to idolatrous people who would eventually be excluded, not just from paradise, but also, most importantly, from the community of those who are called by God. So, you are what you eat. I've already spoke about that. How does the author enforce the boundaries of identity based on this question of food sacrifice to idols? According to sociologists and anthropologists that study food practices and food consumption patterns, food can serve or can become a site for the negotiation and transgressing of ethnic identity boundaries. According to Patricia Kaplan, simple assertions such as we eat meat and they don't. We eat horse, they don't. They eat insects, we don't, affirms in shared patterns of consumption and shared notions of editability, our difference from others. So to the extent that the alternative voices of the apocalypse have deviated from shared Jewish patterns of consumption that John deems to be right, they have compromised in his view their standing as the people of God. And it is in this sense then that they stand to be labeled as a synagogue of Satan. In part too, because of the ways in which this entails their participation in idolatry, or what scholars refer to in this case, a direct reference to the Roman imperial cult, where people participated or offered libations or various foods, from bread to cereal, on behalf of Roman emperors. Now, however, this understanding is definitely dependent on the Jewish notion of idolatry, and hence my insistence that this be seen as a negotiation of ethnic identity. The Hebrew Bible condemns idolatry as worship of gods other than Yahweh, which is something described as unfaithfulness to God through the worship of images. You can find this in the book of Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and also Daniel, among others. Revelation exhibits this Jewish notion of idolatry in the description of those who survived the killing of 1/3 of humankind. And I quote, "The rest of humankind, who were not killed by the plagues, did not repent of the work of their hands, or gave up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze, and stone and wood, which cannot see nor walk." Outside the wall, having defined the others as idolatrous, John proceeds to enact their exclusion. He enforces their exclusion by associating them first with Satan, and situating them among the inhabitants of the earth who are deceived to worship the beast. This group is present both in Smyrna and in Philadelphia, and according to John, they are claiming to be Jews, but in his view, they are not. So they must be lying. The author claims that they are not Jews, and that an indication of this is that they are engaging in the worship of the beast. It's interesting that this is indicated not just in their designation as a synagogue of Satan, but also in a reference to their slander or blasphemia in the Greek, which Christians translate as slander, but maybe rightly translate as blasphemy itself. The author refers to Satan too as the ancient dragon or serpent, who is the accuser. But one particular characteristic of Satan in Revelation is that he also appears as a blasphemer. In fact, in chapter 13, verse 1, when he appears with multiple names on his heads, they are inscribed in each and one of them blasphemous names. And I quote, "And the beast also uttered blasphemous words against God." So just as the opposition in Pergamum and Thyatira, as the horde of Satan and as the assembly of Belial at Qumran, the so-called synagogue of Satan is now excluded from the people of God. Like the sons of the pit, they are also bound to share in Satan's destruction in the lake of fire. Now, it's interesting to think about the rhetoric of walls in our day today and the ways in which borders and boundaries become part of the political rhetoric. And this has been going on for quite some time. John imagines his own version of Trump's wall, so to speak, when he talks about the New Jerusalem as being surrounded by four walls that are meant primarily to exclude the so-called synagogue of Satan and the worshippers of the beast from entering the holy city. In chapter 21, John sees this vision of the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And I quote, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, prepared as a bride, as adorned for her husband." Recalling the book of Ezekiel, John has a vision of an angel that measures the temple and the city itself. The city is a perfect cube, and its length, breadth, and height are equal, each measuring about 1,200 miles. So it's definitely of gargantuan proportions, a dimension exceeding all human imagination. On the other hand, the height of the walls, as Jürgen Roloff notes, is 144 cubits, or about 200 feet. So the description of the New Jerusalem as a city with walls creates a particular conundrum for scholars, eager to identify the city as the ideal paradise. In his well-known commentary on the book of Revelation, Robert H. Mound states that the reference to a wall does not suggest the need for security or precautions, nor does it imply that Christians are a separate people. So in order to calm the already skeptic reader, Mound states that the wall is simply part of the description of an ideal city, just as it was conceived by people in antiquity who were used to the strong protection that external walls provided. Yet, when we read the text closer, and in view of the so-called polemic against the synagogue of Satan, and the polemic against those that consume and promote food sacrifice to idols, we find that the walls are actually meant to exclude those particular individuals from sharing in the paradise of God. And this is reinforced by the author when he states, and I quote, "Outside the city, that is, in its walls, are the dogs, the sorcerers, the fornicators, the murderers, and idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. There should not be found within the city anything impure or corrupted." And unless someone has any doubts, he also notes that those who worship idols will also share in the fate of Satan in the lake of fire. Well, finally, another strategy for demarcating the boundaries that the author uses is placing the so-called synagogue of Satan among the so-called conquered nations. And it's interesting that in Revelation, becoming like the nations on account of idolatry is definitely a central theme. The author excludes those who claim to be Jews by situating them among the Gentile inhabitants of the earth. Throughout Revelation, he portrays these people as being gullible and easy to deceive, but also stubborn, as they refuse to abandon the worship of the beast. The idea of the nations as being conquered is a common trope too in the ancient world. In the slide that you see here, we have a representation of Claudius' conquest of Britannia, where Britannia is represented as a feminine figure, vanquished and unable to defend itself. We see a similar idea of the nations represented in the book of Revelation, where the nations are unable to see the ways in which they are being subjected by the beast, but to an extent too feminized. to an extent, too, they are being subjected insofar as both the beast and the lamb stand to conquer them. And in fact, given the religious and socioeconomic implications of the representation of the nations, it also appears that to partake in sacrifices to idols or idol food amounts to joining the so-called ethnic, and in fact, to being conquered by the beast and by the dragon. So, negotiating the political situation. According to scholars, this idea of the polemic over food sacrificed to idols refers to a prophetic rivalry that was going on in Revelation. For some, this is a representation or an allusion or reference to the cult to the Roman emperors. Now, why would people engage in this practice? According to some scholars, participating in meats offered or foods offered to Greco-Roman deities or to the emperor was a common expectation among certain guilds or groups of merchants or voluntary associations, bakers, shoemakers, and so on, who wanted to carve a space, to use the words of Philip Harlan, in the city. It was a way of claiming that they belonged and that they shared in the city's future hopes and expectations. Elizabeth Schuster Ferenza adds that participating in these particular rituals to the emperor did not demand creedal adherence, but was in fact a civil political gesture. Some might have argued that it was possible to do so without compromising one's faith. In any case, as Michael Dietler notes, the link between commensality and politics have made food for sure a central arena for the working out of power struggles and of colonized consciousness and strategies for appropriation and resistance. Thus, to participate or to abstain from food offered to idols may reveal more than food taste. It may also reveal the political pressures forcing diaspora Jews to rethink Jewishness in the context of the Roman imperial occupation of Asia Minor. Thank you.
Can't say you didn't cover anything.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Martha. I'd like now to ask you some questions, elaborate on a few points
How are we doing on time?
of your presentation. I'd like to take about 10 to 15 minutes to talk, and then we'll open it up and see if there's any questions from the gathering. First of all, thank you. Always enlightening. So I have some questions. I also have some points that I'd
Sure.
like you to review and elaborate from your lecture for my own benefit and for the benefit of especially students in my Jewish Christian relations
Of course.
class. So at 2 points in your lecture, you referred to the parting of the ways discourse. And this is something that comes up in our studies. I'd like you to perhaps first epitomize the discourse in a way that has a bit more dimension, and then to offer some strategies that contemporary scholars have taken to problematize the parting of the ways discourse.
So you've addressed this in class?
It's come up, and it will come up more in the weeks to come.
Yes. So in reference to the book of Revelation, this parting of the ways discourse, it's important for understanding not just of Revelation but other Christian texts, in the sense that it kind of makes or helps scholars categorize particular texts. The problem is that at the moment that you presuppose the parting of the ways and you apply a label Christian or Jew to a text, you're actually bound to particular methodologies and approaches. So there's a polemic about whether or not Revelation is a Christian text or a Jewish text. And the implications are interesting, but they all hinge on this idea of the parting of the ways, in that the presupposition that Christianity and Judaism separated in the first century is fraught by many problems. One of them being that there was no consolidated Judaism, to my knowledge, in the first century, or a consolidated type of Christianity in the first century. And so when we don't interrogate this particular discourse, we end up embracing the fallacies that Jesus was the founder of Christianity, or that St. Paul was consciously creating a new religion. And so in view of recent efforts by some Jewish scholars in particular to view the New Testament in its Jewish setting, we've been able to begin, I suppose, to disentangle this particular issue, but also to offer perhaps new insights into issues like the one I just addressed, where by critiquing this idea of the parting of the ways, moving away from the methodologies that implies, I'm able to come up, or to at least propose, a new reading, as I just did today, of the Synagogue of Satan.
Thank you. So perhaps by looking away from this idea of a path that splits into two, it opens up new opportunities for looking at multiple constructions of the identity, or multiple iterations of the so-called imagined community. Does that sound
Yes.
good? Yeah.
For sure.
So you also you raised the question of the imperializing contradiction in the Apocalypse. John, again, for our benefit, I'd be grateful if you just review the nature of this contradiction.
Sure.
And perhaps discuss a bit about whether or not we see this kind of contradiction already at play in ancient Jewish texts, in the Hebrew Bible, or in other second temple texts.
Yes, of course. The first part of your question, to revisit the imperializing contradiction, Revelation as a text that critiques Roman imperialism. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it in class, but scholars agree that there is a very strong critique of Roman imperialism, where the author writes in some sort of codified way to critique Roman symbols of power. So when he talks about this woman who sits on the beast and so on, he's referring, scholars argue, to Rome, and the beast itself referring to the Roman emperor. So Latin American scholars, I suppose, scholars in the global south, have embraced this critique of empire. They've also embraced the hope that the idea of paradise in the New Jerusalem as a city where the oppressed, the sick, the hungry won't, thirst or hunger anymore. But in fact, they will, be provided for. But not only that, they will have access to God. So this, on the one hand, seems to be the liberating dimension. And so the book of Revelation has been invoked or used by many to critique contemporary empires in our world today. Some people would argue, including America. Now that's on the one hand, but on the other, scholars have also identified that Revelation itself borrows from symbols of Roman imperial power. When it refers to Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So these are appropriations of Roman imperialism, in some ways to critique Roman imperialism, which some people find quite ironic. Now the second part of your question, how in the Hebrew Bible, how we see those imperializing contradictions today? Yes, Professor Musa Dubi refers to imperializing text as text that, first of all, legitimate travel, the travel of the conquerors from one place to another. The second aspect of this imperializing text is that they feminize the land, but also the occupants of the land, as being weaker and inferior. But then ultimately, there's also this divine command that God has somehow legitimated, particular conquest of a region. So when looking at texts such as Joshua, in the conquest of Jericho and the spies encounter with Rahab, well, how is Rahab represented? How are the inhabitants of Jericho represented? And we see that the feminizing or the representation of these people as cowards and so on. And we see the same dynamic kind of playing out here in Revelation, where he not only refers to those he disagrees with as synagogue of Satan, but he also feminizes them throughout the text as cowards and so on. The question about legitimizing travel is also an interesting one in the Hebrew Bible. It seems that as the narratives move along, it seems to always be that God is somewhere in the background, enabling people, getting them out of Egypt, calling Abraham out of his land, and then promising him another land. So Musa Dubi and other scholars have been attempted to this, again, as a way of looking at the ways in which the text not only may be life-giving on the one hand, but also the ways in which they might be used to reinforce oppressive structures of domination.
Thank you for that. Actually, with a similar set of contradictions in mind, that I chose the image for the lecture series flyer. I don't know if anybody noticed, but it features a romantic era depiction of the evangelical image of Jesus casting moneylenders out of the temple. And I think this is an example of a narrative that's similarly double-edged. Right? On the one hand, it's liberating. Right? It's an emblem of freedom from economic oppression and liberation from hypocrisy. On the other hand, it's a delineation of a purified Christian precinct. And if you scrutinize this particular image, there is also racial dimensions that are at play in the way in which Jesus has been depicted on one hand, and the swarthy scions of the temple are represented. So thank you.
No, thank you.
Very interesting iteration of, I think, this very ethics of interpretation that you're championing. So many questions. Another question I have is, to what extent are these first century discursive constructions of ethnicity the outcome of Hellenic and Hebraic cultural or even ethnic hybridity?
To what extent?
Again, so to what extent do you see these discursive constructions, formations of ethnicity that you're describing? To what extent are do they result from a pre-existing meshing of cultures, Hellenic and Hebraic, indicative of first century conditions?
Yes, but I think those would go back even further.
Yeah.
I mean, you could go back to the conquest of Alexander, the spread of Hellenism, and also the needs in particular for Jews in the diaspora to define themselves. We can look at Philo of Alexandria, for instance, in its Legatio ad Gaiam, the ways in which there seems to always be this tension with the Greeks. Right? And initially, this is on grounds of access to political power, and the Jews continuously insisting that they need to have equal rights and so on. But you see the tension then with the Greeks that no, we can't grant you citizenship and so on. And then the response that we've been here since the founding of the city itself. Why is it that we're not, being acknowledged? And so, but this also then includes a categorization not just of Jews, but also of Egyptians, and other peoples in ethnic terms. So I would say that this has been going, that this was happening way before. And in the background, it seems that somehow imperial pressures were always there. And this idea of divide and conquer, or divide and keep your rule, at least in the case of Alexandria, seems to be playing out very well for the Romans.
Another question I have for you is, when we invoke terminology like race and ethnicity, sometimes this calls to mind certain contemporary constructions that may or may not apply
Mhm.
when we look at the first century. And just as you cautioned us against constructions, anachronistic constructions of
Right.
apocalypse, I wonder if you might say a word about similarities and distinctions between contemporary conceptions of ethnicity and first century constructions of ethnicity.
Yes, I think it is important to clarify from the get-go that race does not have a verifiable essence to it. I mean, it is a social construct, after all, and the same can be said of ethnicity. These are ways in which people define or establish or legitimize ideas of kinship and belonging. And again, going back to Benedict Anderson and his work on imagined communities, these are ways that people articulate their claims to a particular group, religious, cultural, but also ethnic. This is obviously tied to 18th, 19th century ideas of the nation. And this presupposes ideas of belonging that can go back to the Enlightenment, and that of course cannot be read back into a first century text, which will obviously be problematic. And you can also apply the critique of class. Right? Our understanding of class today, critiques of class at least, have been influenced by Marxist theory and so on. And so when you think about antiquity, well, you don't have the revolutions that at times those categories presuppose, for sure. So what do we do when we look at first century texts and the ways in which people articulate notions of belonging, peoplehood, kinship, and descent? The work of Denise Kimberly Buell was particularly enticing because she says, well, let's take advantage of the fact that ethnicity and race do not necessarily point to an exact definite thing, but are in fact social constructs. So she talks about the fixity and fluidity of race. So this concept of ethnic reasoning, I think, is helpful in that it kind of pushes us to think, rather than apply a category, to be more attentive at the ways in which the people themselves are defining their identities, the ways at the language that they are using to, again, make claims of belonging to a particular community, and proceed from there, rather than to apply the categories flat on them when they may not apply. I can say more on that, but it can take a while.
I'm intrigued, and I'm tempted to